Just very briefly, I am from Certs, the Clean Energy Resource Teams. We are a partnership, and we help work with communities to help them build their clean energy future. And the reason the word "their" is underlined is because we're not trying to do something for someone else. We're trying to support other people's efforts. We talk a lot about coming alongside communities and helping them do what they want to do, get to scale faster, get a project done more quickly because they're able to draw on other models. You can see our mission, but one of the things that we talk a lot about is just helping people understand what are the practical steps and giving them some technical assistance to help move that forward, and then helping connect them to other resources, tools, guides, people that will help them get to action more quickly. I mentioned that Certs is a partnership. I'm based at the University of Minnesota in Extension and the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships, but our other partners are the Great Plains Institute, the Southwest Regional Development Commission, and the Minnesota Department of Commerce Division of Energy Resources. All of those are a bit of a mouthful. And that is the extent of all of my intro slides I will share with you. Okay, so here's what we're going to cover. I want to start by just actually getting some of your thoughts on this topic before we dive in. And then I'm going to share a few examples of photos. I'm actually going to use you as some guinea pigs to test out something that we're working on. And then I want to talk a little bit about areas of alignment between solar and agriculture. It's nice to start by thinking about where do these things really come together? Where do they make a lot of sense together? And then I want to talk a little bit about sort of farmland by the numbers, some solar by the numbers, and that's going to help you start to think about sort of where we're starting to hear a little bit more of a like, I don't know how that works. And I would say right now that the take-home message of this presentation is that perspective matters. Sort of where you're starting from, how you think about things. So many of you here in this room are probably solar people. So when you see solar panels, you automatically have this kind of rosy perspective. Not all of the folks who are having solar put on their lands are solar people. So they don't immediately have a knee-jerk, solar is lovely. And that kind of perspective matters. Perspective also matters in terms of sort of distance, spacing, screening, all of that. But we'll get into that as we go. So to start, what do you think about when you hear solar and agriculture? What comes to mind? Literally just call it out.
Solar,
yeah.
Sometimes they have, two sides to it, the solar and the agriculture is diminished. And if you have plants, then I guess it doesn't matter about solar because you eat it, whatever.
Right. So sometimes it feels like a trade-off between the two. Yeah.
I would say solar on non-productive land.
Solar on non-productive land, right. That's a better fit. Other thoughts? Go ahead.
Socioeconomics, especially for like international, like agricultural farmers and other stuff. Yeah, the price of solar compared to what else they're already struggling with.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a big question that comes up a lot. Sam, go ahead.
I think of the political divisions in some areas that try to block you, that don't want solar in there.
Interesting.
Our township, no. Any place else, that'd be great.
The sort of NIMBY kind of thing. Okay. Yeah, interesting. Other thoughts?
Screening of the solar. People have talked about, they don't want to see it, so they want lots of trees around it.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So let's look at a few examples. So one of the things that we have been trying to figure out, so a lot of times we hear a lot about screening. We hear a lot about pollinators. We hear a little more in the sort of last year or so about a concept called agrivoltaics. Have you all heard this term? So it's sort of dual use. It's both solar and agriculture, and spacing the solar such that you can still grow stuff underneath it. And you'd probably get less production from both the solar and the food product, right? But that with the two combined, you'd get sort of more revenue than you would have gotten from either one or the other. So there are lots of things, like that. But one of the things that we hear a lot is that people just sort of feel like they're not sure how that will look. How will that look in my landscape? How does that look? Like if I've always lived here and this is what I'm used to, does this fit with what I expect? So I want you to put yourself in the position that your neighbor has just done solar. And so you now are the person looking at the image that I put up, okay? Are you ready for my thought experiment? We're just gonna try it, see what you think. How about this one? Do you like it? Yeah? Is this sort of like your iconic, solar and agriculture?
So that bit makes me squeamish because they chew on those wires. You know.
Yes. So good point. You want to have sheep, not goats.
Oh, I see.
Right. Okay. So not goats. That could be another take-home message. No goats with your solar. Okay. How about this one?
We like that.
You like that. Okay. So one of the ones, something that's interesting about this is that these are actually taller, right? So these are about 10 feet up off the ground, and this is a 50 kilowatt array that actually provides shading for these cows. And it was actually designed with that intention, so built taller than you might otherwise, so that it could actually provide some shade. This is actually at the West Central Research and Outreach Center out in Morris. Yeah, so it's a fun example. Okay, how about this one?
Ooh.
Okay, what made you say ooh?
Well, you get a good hard belly washer of a rain and it looks like you don't have anything to hold it back.
Okay. Other thoughts? You shook your head. Not so much.
Lopsided.
Well, the picture is a little cattywampus, so yeah, for sure.
Is that gravel under there or something?
I think it's just dirt right now.
Dirt?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those things, right? So what's going to be underneath it? And what's underneath it does kind of matter, right? If your neighbor did this, and this is what was next to you, you might think, that's dirt. Something's going to happen in a rain or something, right? Okay, how about this one?
Goes with dirt.
Goes with dirt. So here's a quick thought. One of the things that happens a lot when we talk about solar and agriculture, we talk a lot about sort of pollinator habitat, and that's great, and there's a big movement toward that, and that's fantastic. And when you see those pictures, they're always pictures in the summer. Have you ever noticed that? Well, winter happens in Minnesota, right? And so that is something that we actually have to think about, is sort of what does it look like in the winter? This is actually corn stover, or maybe a little bit hard to tell, but this is a cornfield right adjacent to the solar system. And I just think it's important to show pictures of winter. I will also say that when you ask people, do you like this or not? Often Minnesotans, their gut reaction to seeing a snow field is like, no, especially in August when you ask them if they like the way that the snow looks, not so much. Okay, so here's another one. How about this?
Better.
Yeah?
That's good.
Especially in contrast to the winter photo, huh? Right? But then the other thing to think about with this one is it does have something to do with perspective, right? Because now you're a lot closer to it in some ways, but you don't know if there's a fence. Is there a fence? Is there a fence back over here? How close is it to the road? Is it near a road, right? So you don't necessarily have that perspective.
What is that?
What is it growing?
Is that,
It's prairie.
is that a pump, a water pump, or?
No.
It's a rotator.
It's a rotator, so you can tilt the panels to maximize that angle. Yeah. Yeah? Okay. How about this one?
It looks utilitarian, but it's got plants underneath it, because
Yeah.
it's got the big power lines there
Yeah,
anyway, so
compared to
when
what's
you
in the
swing
back.
Right.
It's
So-
right next to the road, you can see the road right there in the corner.
Exactly. So one of the interesting things about this, so often when you ask people to sort of identify what's in an image, if there are power lines in the background, they don't necessarily see them. If you're actually out in a place, power lines are something that we start to just sort of expect to be on the landscape, and we don't actually notice it as much. But in this picture, the first thing I notice, and maybe if it's this kind of power line, maybe you're more likely to notice it, but my eyes go straight to that, which I just think is sort of an interesting contrast. And one of the things that we've heard people talk about a good bit is that some of the infrastructure related to solar, the substations and that kind of stuff, is actually the part that bothers. It's not the panels themselves, it's the related wires and all of that. So that's something to think about. Okay.
The thing that I think about sometimes is the maintenance. So the installer's gonna put it all up, they're out of there in a month or something. And then, like you're saying, laying under it
Yeah.
changes.
Right.
And they're out of the picture now.
Right.
So now who takes care of it?
Yeah. And so those are some valid questions that people have. I mean, this is maybe one of those examples. This actually might be more related to the fact that it's during construction, right? And during the time that you're actually developing all of the plant cover underneath, it takes time for it to come up. So if there's, that earlier picture that we saw, that was just seemed like it was more dirt. It could just be that that's an interim period, but then you have to be mindful of what washes off. Okay, so that's something else to think about. Also, notice this fence versus this fence. So ag fencing versus a chain link fence, that has a lot to do with people's perception around screening. People notice a fence, different kinds of fences. An ag fence, sort of feels like it fits a little bit more on the landscape, but you can also sort of see some of the infrastructure behind the panels. Okay. So one of the things that we're trying to do and that we're hoping to do at the state fair this year, so when you all are working at the state fair, come in and see us, okay? We're trying to figure out if we can do almost like a visual preference survey with people.
Are you going to be in the eco experience?
We are going to be in the eco experience. We'll be just inside, I think, of where you are. Okay. But we're trying to figure out if we can do a little bit of a visual preference survey to have people say, like, do you like this? Do you not like this? And just start to have people get a sense for, like, what is it that is triggering you, liking it or not? And then we even have some questions about, are you part of the solar industry? Do you know a lot about solar? Do you not know a lot about solar? Because we're sort of curious about how that might affect it. We're asking where people are from. So if you're from an urban area or a township or an unincorporated area, because people's sense of place really varies based on some of those factors, right? And so what they expect to see on the landscape will also vary. But we talk a lot in our work about areas of alignment between solar and agriculture. There are lots of things that actually go hand in hand. This last year, Minnesota Farmers Union worked with the Farmers Legal Action Group, or FLAG, to put together this document here on the left, which is a farmer's guide to solar and wind energy in Minnesota. This is essentially to help farmers who are looking at leasing their land understand what kinds of questions to ask. What are the common things that you see in an agreement? And what are the things that you want to be looking for before you sign? They also, of course, recommend that you go to an attorney, but this is at least a good starting point for folks to understand what those options are.
And what's the site? Flag?
Flaginc.org. Yep. And if you Google Farmer's Guide to Solar and Wind Energy, it would absolutely be there, but you could go right to their website.
You can't get to it from your website? Start with Certs and then go in?
I'm sure you can, but Google is the miracle worker, and you could probably just go right there. The other thing, that we've been talking a lot about, we've been part of a group that's doing outreach around this documentary called The Power of Minnesota. And it's just a lot of storytelling about clean energy around the state, but includes a lot of stories from farmers. The gentleman pictured over here on the right is Ed Eichten from Eichten Farms. He has buffalo, that free range. He also now has solar. And so he talks a lot about sort of the value of that, but the quote that you see up there is actually from the Chisago County Administrator, talking about also the new tax revenue that's coming into the county because of the large solar installations. And that's really helping the county, make economic ends meet and avoid having to have tax increases. So those are some benefits and sort of co-benefits that you get off of the landscape.
So where does that $250,000 come from?
It comes from tax revenue from the larger scale solar projects.
So they actually tax the solar projects?
There's a production tax that comes back to local counties. So it's 80% county and then 20% township is how that revenue stream is divided. There's a little concern about that actually around solar gardens, because the cap, so if it's a project that's 1 megawatt or smaller, they don't pay that tax. And right now, all of the solar gardens that are going in around the state are 1 megawatt. And so now all of those jurisdictions who are hosting and providing that are not getting a co-benefit stream from that development. So that's one of the things people are trying to figure out, well, how do we navigate that? Because we'd like to get that
So why did they get
co-benefit.
Why did they give the county or the city, whatever, that tax stream from the solar? And what do they have to do with it?
Go ahead.
That's just a property tax.
It's a production.
Yeah, they don't
Tax.
pay for the value of the solar they produce, so they don't pay the way it is.
So
They're paying property tax.
Oh,
So they're paying like a farmer.
So do farmers pay property tax?
Yes.
Oh, they do?
Yes.
Yeah.
But this is a production tax that also recognizes that you're having additional infrastructure put in to host these systems. and that there's a cost related to
They charge
that.
an extra property tax if you have solar.
It's a production tax. It's not actually a property tax. It's a production tax that comes off how much is produced. Yep. Yeah.
I think it's fair, because if you have a little natural gas well, I'm sure they tax
Yes.
the heck out of that, so you might as well tax your electricity a little bit too, that's being produced.
I didn't know that.
It's trying to also acknowledge that local hosts of projects should see also commensurate benefit that they would from this kind of development, just as they would in other kinds of
You're
development.
saying that 80% goes to the farmer and then 20%.
80% goes to the county and 20% goes to the township of the production tax. The farmer is getting a lease payment typically, which is a separate thing, and their property taxes may also change. So depending on how the land is currently taxed, it may go from ag to industrial. And so they may also have to pay more property tax. But those are two different things. Yes, we're going right down into the weeds. Go ahead.
I'll try to stay out of the
No,
weeds.
it's good.
I'm wondering, if you're a farmer, and I know one who's been approached by one of these 1 megawatt developers, are they offered something better than what they would normally get for leasing out their land to another farmer anyway?
To farm it?
Yeah, they are. Substantially, or what do you think? Oh, good, okay. 'Cause he turned it down. He turned it down, so
Well, and those are all personal preferences, right? I mean, yeah. Okay, let's look at a couple more photos. So these are some examples of just, I mean, this is sort of an iconic, right? The red barn with solar on it. Oh, they're so perfect together. But I will say that, this is a little bit dark, but there are a lot of examples of particularly livestock farmers who use solar because they're often the heaviest users of energy in agriculture, those livestock producers. They use a lot of electric for fans and cooling systems, vents, all of that. And so it works really well to align it with solar. And so they, can do roof mount or, barn mount. Often these systems are actually ground mount, just easier to do any repairs that might need to be done, and you don't have to worry about structural concerns. This is an example of that agrovoltaics concept that I mentioned earlier. This is actually a plot out in Massachusetts, and these are some photos from NREL. And this is kale, growing underneath, and the panels are spaced so that you're still getting the right amount of light. And there are lots of folks who even do, like research in silvopasture, which is, you'd put trees up, and they say, oh, some of that same stuff can be applied to thinking about how might you space solar to still get food production, which is kind of a fun concept. And then many of you are familiar with these sorts of iconic photos, right, that show the beautiful pollinator habitat underneath it, which is then providing a value add on the landscape, both in terms of sort of capturing water runoff and capturing, water just in general, but also adding back into that soil, right? So now you have perennials on that landscape that's helping rebuild the carbon in the soil and helping fix the soils right in that place, which can provide lots of co-benefits. And one of the things that we've been hearing lots of folks talk about is that for some farmers, Sam, this is sort of related to your question, that thinking about having a solar garden actually feels kind of appealing, especially, in that sort of 1 megawatt. I think this is a 2 megawatt. But at 1 megawatt, it's say 6 to 8 acres. And so if somebody has, a couple hundred acres and you put 6 to 8 acres in solar, now you have a known revenue stream. And getting to your earlier point, you know that you've got money coming in. Whatever happens in the farm economy, you've still got this land lease payment, and you know that you have at least some sort of stable base in terms of, that economic cash flow on your landscape. So those are some things to think about in terms of ways people are thinking about them aligning. The next set of slides are from my colleague Fritz Ebinger, and he has done some really fun work in this space, and actually in partnership with Department of Agriculture and Department of Commerce for some convenings that they were hosting, looking at just farmland and sort of understanding how much land is in farms and sort of helping put a little bit of the conversation around solar and farmland in context. So this is an example of the Marshall Solar Project out in southwest Minnesota. It was a 62 megawatt project that took up about 515 acres. This is one of those projects that had some of the first controversy around, are we really going to put solar on prime agricultural lands? And there were a lot of questions about, is this the right thing to do? Were there other alternatives? Is there an ag mitigation plan? How are we going to handle that? And you can get a sense for how big that space is. I mean, this is covering, sort of parts of these two areas within the township. Sorry, I can actually give you numbers. Steve Roos, you can probably tell me numbers right off the top of your head. But if you think about a square mile being 640 acres, right? So this is less than that, but approaching that, right? And so it gives you a sense. It's kind of a big area, right? Okay. Right now, Minnesota has 25 million acres of land in farms, and these are data points from the most recent ag census that was published in April of 2019. That was across 68,500 farm operations. So still have lots of farms in Minnesota, still covers a lot of land. And if we go to the next one, you can also then just sort of see some trends in terms of what farmland has done over time in Minnesota. And you can see that we have farmland numbers falling, and here's 2007, and we're down not quite 1.5 million, right? So we've been losing farmland a little over 100,000 acres a year.
So what's it being lost to?
Often it's lost to sort of residential and commercial development. I mean, that's probably not the only thing, but that seems to be the dominant thing. And one of the questions that we get a lot, so when people have been talking about pollinator habitat, and that could help with conservation and putting more perenniality back on the landscape and all of that, one of the things that people think a lot about is conservation lands, and sort of how would that help with conservation lands, even if it's not part of a conservation program? Would it be adding value to conservation lands? And so you can get a sense for sort of what those numbers look like. In that same time period between 2007 and 2017, we've lost actually quite a bit of conservation lands, or had lands that were taken out of conservation programs. Part of that, as we understand it, is that people were getting paid less for that conservation land, which then also makes one think, well, if they were doing conservation lands and could have solar and have a revenue stream on it, maybe that would be appealing to some folks who were saying, well, not really getting paid quite enough, and I can put some of my land back into production. Maybe that would help sort of make that case for them. And then if you think about prime farmland, so this is back to your, let's put it on the not as awesome farmland. Thankfully, Minnesota is blessed by lots of awesome farmland. And frankly, we have a lot of really great farmland in a lot of the same places that people think about doing solar development, right? So a lot of it, I mean, obviously we're not going to put it up in the North Woods, but this whole area, a lot of that is prime farm soils. And we were actually doing an experiment, a fun group activity at a convening hosted by the Department of Ag and Department of Commerce, where we were looking at a county and we were trying to avoid prime ag soils. And one of the things that was sort of interesting to think about is in some counties, there's just a lot of prime soil. And the only areas that aren't in prime soils are cities, municipal areas, or water bodies. So, that just is sort of a tricky thing to think about. And then when you think about solar, a developer will say, the top thing I'm looking for is how I'm going to get my power to market. I need a point of interconnection. I need transmission. I need to be able to get my power to market. That is the first and foremost thing that I think about. And basically everything after that is kind of secondary. You need a willing landowner. That's pretty important. But a lot of the other factors really don't come in until kind of further down in the process. And then you're sort of thinking about, okay, well, I've got transmission and I've got a willing landowner, and here we go. A lot of what we've seen in Minnesota is through community solar garden development. And that's, you can see it's almost 60% of the pie. But it is anticipated that a lot of the development that is coming is actually at that utility scale. More than 50 megawatts. Maybe even, we've heard some developers say, I'm not looking at anything smaller than 100. So all of those earlier photos that show sort of alignment between the two, one of the questions is sort of, how does that scale? How does that alignment then work when it's a square mile, right? When it's 600 acres or 1,000 acres instead of 500. And that's the thing that people are really trying to sort out. You can get a sense for sort of where there are projects being proposed, and this sort of reflects what you would expect from solar gardens. A lot of that development has been done around the metro because that's where you can have that geographic relationship. That's where you have those off-takers. And we've already started to see some communities say, we would like to be done now. Like the first one was awesome, and the second one was really good, and the third one was pretty great, and the fourth one was, it was fine. And then people start to have a little bit of that fatigue. And of course, that makes sense. And part of that fatigue is also just related to people don't really know how much more is coming, right? So one of the questions that we get a lot is, are there gonna be 100 more of these that come? Are there gonna be 10 more? Are there gonna be 2 more? And there isn't a lot of differentiating for most folks between a solar garden and a large solar farm. They sort of think of those things as the same. And the fact that the scale is quite different, 8 acres versus 800 acres, also isn't really in that sort of mindset. And when you have small solar gardens, you also then get more substations, more infrastructure, and all of that. And if that's one of the things that people are like, I don't like how that looks, then you're actually getting more of that per solar panel, right? And so I think it's just really tricky to think about. When you start to think about where development, this is stuff that's in the MISO queue, so not all of this will be built, but it gives you a sense for where people are thinking about development. Not surprisingly, dominantly, the wind is down here. Solar, you can sort of see up here, which is largely solar gardens, and then you're seeing some bigger projects down here, a little bigger project up in Chisago. But people are anticipating that we're going to start to see more solar proposed all over southern Minnesota, which is largely where the ag land is.
When you're in a rolling hill area,
Yeah.
then the solar goes in and it's sort of uneven, so it's not like a perfectly flat.
Yeah.
And I always wonder why they don't just bulldoze it to make it flat, so it looks pretty.
Because I think there are people who really want that land to maintain its integrity, right? They don't want to take that soil and that top layer off, and they really are trying to preserve that. And in fact, in some instances, having the solar go on top of that is actually sort of more of that like marginal land, and you're helping protect that hillside, help protect erosion, help protect stormwater runoff, and all of that. So that, I would say, even if it to your eyes does not look pretty, there's some real benefits. Yeah, okay.
I'm just curious, have you heard, when I was up at the solar factory up in Lane, and I brought up the fact, and Minnesota Power kind of said, yes, they're actually thinking about putting solar on the water that's in the mines up there.
In the mine pits?
Yeah, which I thought was a fascinating idea, to take something that's not being used that much and put it in that location. So maybe some of that up in that area will start filling in.
Oh, yeah. I mean, what's fascinating is NREL, the National Renewable Energy Labs, has been doing some really interesting research on floating solar. And thinking about sort of where would that work, how would that work. I don't think we're quite ready for prime time. There are a lot of people who've had a lot of ideas about those closed mine pits for years. So there's yet another one. One of the questions that we've been trying to get our heads around is just, so if we were going to meet the state's 10% solar energy goal by 2030, how much land is that, right? That's a sort of nice thought experiment to say, okay, if we were to do that, what would it look like? And so if you assume aggressively 7 to 10, 10 being sort of on the high end, acres per megawatt of solar, and and maybe 1 gigawatt is about 2.3% of our total generation now. Let's assume, this is Fritz's thought experiment, right? Let's assume 10% of it's going to be distributed. We're not going to do it in large scale, utility scale solar, okay? And we're going to probably electrify more of our energy loads, even by 2030. We're going to have a lot more people driving EVs, people doing, electric transportation, and then probably a lot more electric heating with people going to air source heat pumps and that kind of thing. So we're going to have more electric use, okay? So let's just, for, sake of easy math, let's assume that that's going to be 10 gigawatts of solar. That looks a little high given sort of the numbers right now, but okay, let's just assume that. What would that look like? If you then take 10 gigawatts, 10,000 megawatts times 10 acres, so we're going on the high end, that would be 100,000 acres of solar. So remember the numbers that we were looking at earlier? We were saying that we were losing about 100,000 acres a year to other kinds of development. So this would be about that much, but that would be about that much over that time period to 2030. And it's not really a lot in the grand scheme of things in terms of numbers. I mean, 0.4% of our farmland isn't a big number. If you look at just the prime soils, it's about 0.6% of prime ag soils. So less than 1%, no matter which one you're looking at. So in some ways, that doesn't feel like a lot. And you sort of get the idea here, right? It's this kind of space. It's about the size of Duluth, the city of Duluth. It's about the same geography. And yet perspective matters, right? Because if this is what that looks like to you, and it looks like this, and it's sort of off over in a field, and it's a lot of solar, this seems okay, right? But what if you were here, right? What if you were now sort of an island in the middle of solar? Or what if it felt like that? And what if there, maybe there's great screening, but maybe there was, right? So your perspective really matters in terms of how you feel about it. And in some ways, I think a lot of conversations almost go to extremes, right? Like on the one hand, it's gonna be beautiful, it's gonna be bees, and it's all gonna be perfect, and it's never gonna snow again, and I feel like sometimes that we sort of fall, like we want it to just be all great. Or we feel like it's gonna be all bad, landowners are gonna be mad, people don't like it, it's gonna hurt my property value, whatever that is. And I think that the truth is that it's probably somewhere a lot closer in the middle. And that it really does matter sort of somebody's place, their sense of place, where they're coming from, that perspective that they're coming from. And so a lot of what we've been doing is having conversations around this. So we had started hosting some conversations over a year ago around solar and agricultural lands. How do those things go together? Where do they go together? Where do you get the best fit for how do they go together? How do farmers feel about that? What are their concerns? There is some real concern about losing prime ag lands and taking land out of production, because there's the sense that there are already lots of pressures on that. And yet there are farmers who are saying, I'd like to be able to retire. This is a way that I'm going to be able to retire. Or I'd like to have some sort of steady income stream to bolster my farm economics, and that makes sense for me. But then you have to have a lot of conversations with your neighbors and get ahead of that, right? And have those conversations. Then there are lots of conversations about property rights. And so, do you get to tell me what I get to do on my land? And all of those sorts of things, right? These are all conversations that happen around all sorts of topics. Solar is just another one of those topics, and we shouldn't assume that just because it's solar and a lot of us like it, that it's any more virtuous or immune to having those conversations than anything else. Our colleagues at the Great Plains Institute, Brian Ross over there, has been having lots of conversations about solar and ecosystem services or natural resource services. Aaron Hansen and Ellen Anderson from the Energy Transition Lab have been a part of a National Renewable Energy Labs project looking at what are those co-benefits? Do we get benefit for stormwater runoff? Do we get better and more diversity in these areas, more bug species, more different kinds of things if we have pollinator habitat under it? What can we say about the difference between having pollinator habitat under it versus grasses under it versus gravel under it? Like, what is all of the data so that we actually have the evidence to show this would be a benefit on the landscape, and we can actually articulate what those benefits look like. Yes?
And I saw a video that Morgan Freeman, I think it was, narrated. And it showed over there in the Buffalo Ridge that when they tilled the soil, when the tractor going along, they were just blowing all the soil away so that the farmer couldn't much use it anyway.
Well, and I think that people are quite excited about the idea of fixing soils through that pollinator habitat. But there are questions about sort of the edges, sort of around the edges, and what happens. Are you going to get runoff at the edges, and how are you going to handle that? How are you going to deal with drain tiles? How are you going to,
I guess that video was saying that since their soil blows away, put it in wind in that case, was an income stream.
Oh, absolutely.
For that, because I guess they wanted to keep the soil from blowing away.
Yeah. I mean, and I think wind has been a great boom to lots of farmers in southwest Minnesota.
This was a neat conversation about bifacial solar. So with our snow in Minnesota, getting that extra production, does that come up at all? And on any of this? I know on like a roof, there's all kinds of positive sides. On farmland with just snow, it seems like it would make a big difference, but
Get growth of plants underneath, you mean?
no, it actually produces.
To increase the production, yeah. To be honest, what I hear mostly is that people just want to, put up as much solar as they can, and some of the bifacial units are a bit more expensive. And so, especially for large projects, that isn't quite price competitive with sort of standard panels. I mean, I could certainly see people thinking about that. I mean, you get some benefit from the snow cover just because it's white and reflects.
But light goes through it too. Light goes through those panels.
No, it just reflects off the ground back to the other side.
I only say that because Marcus was out there putting up the solar lights and a LED light, and he's shining it down on the big solar array. He said, "This will be great. It's going to light stuff up underneath."
Maybe in the spaces.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it probably sort of depends on where the cells are and sort of the light coming
Glass like
through.
glass and for the exhibit out there, Eco Experience.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, it's all good. It's all good. That's why we have a conversation. Absolutely.
Yeah, a little diffuse light that always.
Yeah, and that diffuse light is
Do you guys already
helpful.
talk about the zinc?
We did not.
Don't even bring that up.
Yeah, we did not talk about that.
Chicken.
Oh, we're not going to talk about that.
Let me just say a couple more things, and we can always come back to other topics. So the last thing this is my sort of pet thing that I care about, is solar and rural character or solar and community character. So part of why we're doing that whole, remember I ran you through a bunch of pictures at the beginning just to get a sense for like, how does it make you feel? That's a lot to do with community character. How people feel about something says a lot about sort of if they expect to see that on their landscape, if they want to see it on their landscape, if they want to have their neighbor do that, if they want to see it at the place down the road, if they want to see it on the highway that they drive down every day. And a lot of community character is a little bit fuzzy, right? It's hard to necessarily like put a hard finger on, this is what this is our community's character. And yet we do all have a sense from the places that we are, sort of a sense of what that community character looks like. And one of the things we're trying to get our heads around is sort of, what are the questions that people are asking at that local level? So I've heard some county commissioners who have wind up on their land, and they love it. They love the wind. It's allowed them to do more investing in their farm because they have that income stream. In some instances, they've been able to have their kids come back to the farm and be able to work on the farm because now they have 2 income streams. It's been great. And some of those same farmers at the end of that will say, but I don't know about solar. I don't know if I look out and that's what I see, does that still feel like the landscape that I expect? And for a lot of folks, that might have been the same concern when wind was going up 20 years ago, but now they're kind of used to having it and they've got an income stream, and so now it feels a little bit more like part of the character, right? But solar is newer, and so that's one of those things that we're also trying to understand, like, so what is it about screening, or what is it about ground cover, or what is it about the spacing away from the road, or a setback, or having trees, and what kind of trees, and like, what is it about those things that then makes it feel like, oh yeah, I kind of like it? And one of the real questions that I have is people see those, like an image from a drone, like that sort of overhead image, and now it looks like a lot of solar, right? But none of us are actually drones, and so we're not usually flying over the top of the solar, so it really matters more sort of that perspective right from the side, right? Like, how does it look right there at the level at which you're looking at it? But how do we start to have conversations? So IATP, the Institute for Ag and Trade Policy, has been having these series of rural climate dialogues and have now started to shift those to have conversations about siting. There are lots of researchers who do research on sense of place and sort of people's sense of place and how that influences what they think about on the landscape. There's a researcher from Michigan who's done a lot of work on engagement, and if people are engaged in the process before a project is built, they are more likely to feel good about the project after it's up and running even years later. That if they felt like the process was fair and their voice was heard, even if they didn't actually want that outcome, that they are more likely to feel good about a project. And of course, not surprisingly, when people financially benefit from a project, they feel better about it.
Does it make any difference to people in terms of character if you raise the panels up and you see cows underneath them and stuff?
It can. I mean, not universally, but it can.
That's much more expensive.
It is more expensive, yeah. But I mean, the other thing, so if you already had a dairy farm near you and the dairy added solar and the panels were taller to accommodate shade for cows, that's, yeah, okay. But now if you live, I live in Minneapolis, and if my neighbor decided they were gonna get dairy cows, you know, I work on the St. Paul campus, and I can tell you that when the wind blows the right way, you smell it, right? I've heard people say that I think it's in Sherburne County, that when you move into the county in a rural place, they give you a packet about what it means to be a rural resident, and that it includes scratch and sniff stickers. And they do it purposefully, right? Because they want people who are moving there to understand you are moving to a rural area, and whatever idea you had about it, we were already here. We live here, and this is how our place is, right? And so all of those factors really do matter. But there are lots of things to be having conversation about. So on which lands? On which lands do we want it? And why right here? Why this part and not this part? Or that one, or over there? And why on one big, strip of land as opposed to broken up on other plots of land? What are those co-benefits? What are those value streams? What are we actually getting out of the development? And how do you balance sort of community needs, a jurisdiction's needs? So jurisdictions have all sorts of questions that they're also running through, and they're the ones that hear from neighbors who are like, I don't like this, right? So they have all the things that they're trying to understand. They're also trying to understand how much development, how much more are we gonna see, all of that. And many of them are trying to figure out, we want this. We wanna have it in our community. So then how do we communicate that? How do we know if we're a good community to host it? Do we have transmission? Whose transmission do we have, right? So these are all sorts of things. And then of course, developers have their own set of needs that they need to make a project cash flow and have it be cash flow positive and get it built in a near-term way. So there are all those sorts of things that you're trying to balance. And then, one thing that we often talk with people about is good neighbor approaches, right? So what is it that you can do both during the development period, but really leading up to development, talking to all of the neighbors about what's going to happen and how they can be involved, making sure that during the development you're doing all sorts of best practices to avoid stormwater runoff and things like that, and that when the plantings go in, they actually stay alive and are well maintained. And that you get screening that helps a neighbor who's just like, if you could just screen my property line right here. But then also not imposing undue costs on a project or making it so difficult to develop that now the project isn't a go, right? And all of those things are all trade-offs and all really depend on your perspective.
I wonder if the neighbors, if maybe they would look at it like, well, this is really solving a problem that is maybe catastrophic for the world. And so maybe you could say, well, look at it from the point of view of this is needed because we're phasing out all the coal plants.
Right.
And so there may be a need-based thing or something that they could feel like they're contributing because,
right. That we're doing sort of our part for this larger thing.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Well, and I think there are a lot of people who feel that way, whether that particular neighbor feels that way or not, and whether they feel like if they're not financially benefiting, but their neighbor is, and now they sort of feel like they're impacted by the project, but they're not benefiting in the same way, should they have to bear that cost? But and some people are like, yes, put it here. We hear from farmers all the time who are like, I want to lease my land. How can I get somebody to come and lease my land? And then invariably we go through the questions of, well, where is your property? And trying to understand, where are they near a substation? Are they near an interconnection point? And they're like, no, our neighbors, they want to do it too, right? And so they've already gone through this because they're on board.
Well,
but I think
I think community solar, they're selling that to individuals because they are thinking about the future of the world. So I don't know, so maybe some other farmers could think that way.
I mean, we've been tossing around ideas like, could you get a group of farmers together, sort of, if you knew sort of where the substation was in your community, could you organize a number of farmers to say, we would all, over here, please, right? Like we'd all really be excited about having it, and that they'd all get a little bit of it on their land, or maybe one landowner would get the bulk of it, but there would be some neighbor payments so that everybody felt like they were able to be involved. And some of that stuff has happened with wind. You know, you've seen wind development, and you get a certain payment if it's on your property, but some of the neighbors also get a payment for it being nearby. And some of those same kinds of practices could bring more people in and feel like, yeah, we're really excited about it. And where it feels like we're all in it together. And that's one of those great things that you can get with solar. I mean, that's one of the things that people were so excited about around community solar, is now it democratizes who can get involved. It's not just the people who have a perfect solar resource or enough money to put up solar, but a whole bunch of us can get involved. And that's one of those great things about even some of the larger scale solar, that now we're gonna get a bunch more of it into our grid, and that's gonna free up all sorts of other options. So there is a lot of enthusiasm. But let's make sure that along with that enthusiasm, we're sort of doing our homework, engaging with people to make sure that they feel like they get a sense for what those benefits are and that they're reaping some of those benefits themselves, either just knowing that they're doing some good or in other ways too, being part of the process. Yeah. That was really philosophical. Okay, sorry, Sam, go ahead.
This is kind of off the track a little bit, but I promise not to go into the weeds.
No, that's okay, you can go to the weeds.
Are farmers no longer concerned about stray energy? Have they calmed down with that?
I think it's still a question, particularly for livestock farmers. There's still some questions. There was actually this really interesting cohort of organizations, including a bunch of some ag organizations, and Department of Agriculture, I think, was part of this, that developed a stray voltage guide that really was talking to people about sort of where does stray voltage come from. And there's been a lot of discussion amongst the development community and even some jurisdictions about really understanding that stray voltage happens because of miswiring. Right? It's not because of solar. And having solar up or having wind up isn't going to be any more likely to cause stray voltage than anything else. And there has been some really interesting conversation around doing some pre-testing. So before something goes in, to make sure that we know, are there actual issues before something? Because if you didn't want a project, and you could imagine how then if there were problems, you could attribute it to a particular project. And so it's still a concern. I mean, I think people are getting more of the facts about sort of what is actually the issue, but you know, people are nervous. They're nervous.
They had that long before solar came along.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, fear's tricky, right? And it's hard to disprove something before, right? So, yeah, tricky. Yeah.
You know, you guys are talking about doing this at the Eco Experience. Did any of you, Certs group or anything, do anything at like Farm Fest?
We did.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So we're at Farm Fest every year, thanks to the gracious hosting of AURI, the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute. They host us at their booth every year. And so we do fun games for kids and contests and giveaways. This year we actually hosted an EV event with a bunch of co-ops at Farm Fest, so that people that were at Farm Fest could come and check out an EV. And we tested out this survey.
I heard that on the news today.
Yeah.
Electric vehicles at Farm Fest.
At Farm Fest. I know, it was lots of fun. We have lots of our staff who took lots of selfies of themselves in front of cars. We tested the survey at Farm Fest with a few folks. What we heard back was like, oh my God, it's so long, it's like painful. So we're trying to, you know, we were testing it. That's what you do with survey instruments. You test them, you get some feedback. They were like, no, it's too long and it's too hard to tell. It's a tiny. So we're going to do some adjustments, but we're hoping that it's going to be a tool that we could use in some different settings if we can get it right sized to really be an intercept survey.
It'd be really interesting in you know, the difference between the urban and the...
Oh, absolutely. And that's part of our thinking. Like, if you had a tool that was available and different folks could use it, then you could get some data from lots of different places and be able to do some comparisons. Yeah. I don't think we're there. We're not there yet, but we're working in that direction. Yep. Other questions? Other thoughts or reactions?
I got it when I first saw my first 10 megawatt solar farm. I didn't like it because I wanted to see green. I just didn't want to see, you know, that big black space there where I was expecting green. So
It's different than wind. And my family reunions are where there's a lot of wind.
Yeah.
And it's different. You still see the land. It's,
Yeah. I mean, and I'll say it really is about perspective, and it's all in the eye of the beholder, right? So I've been at meetings with farmers, and one person will be like, I am so excited about solar. I don't want to have to see that wind turbine, and you can't screen it with anything, right? And then you'll hear the flip. I am so excited about wind. It's just there, and you can farm right up to the base and not, right? So,
yeah.
I mean, walk up to a farmer and they're going to have their own opinion, and it may not be anything like the next farmer you talk to, just like anybody in this room is going to have a different opinion about nearly anything. And that's just to be expected.
I'll just say about my first visual impression was I'd be willing to 2 years from now I won't even care. You know, I just expect to see it there. Oh,
right.
That big black thing there.
Well, and I think that is one of those other things that it's hard to anticipate, right? How people will feel about it over time. Because initially, when people were, driving down the highway and seeing wind turbines, that might have been something that felt jarring out in, places where they see wind turbines now all the time and just think, yeah, it's the wind turbines. I mean, like, you don't even really take it in.
I like the set of the wind turbines. The only thing I don't like about them is, say, when you're going up 35 before you get to the state of Minnesota, all the red lights are blinking at the same time. It's like,
I have heard very funny jokes from people who live near those lights about being in the Redlight District. That is absolutely something that people are working on, and that's one of those things that they're actually trying to get to the point where that technology, that the lights wouldn't flicker unless there's actually a trigger that says, an FAA trigger, and that there's a plane coming, and so now they need to be on for that safety, but then otherwise they would turn off. And it's not seemingly quite commercially deployable yet, but it's very close. And they're talking about being able to retrofit turbines potentially. I mean, it actually is, it's a concern for people then who live right near there, and it's something that people are working on. That's the other thing that's, I think, interesting, is that even something that initially felt like, I don't like that. There are lots of things that we can go back and then figure out, well, how do we do that? If we planted something and then it didn't survive, can we come back in and replant? Or can we have a better sense of when to do plantings? If you planted it in December, maybe that's not the best time to do the planting. Maybe we should wait and do it in the spring, or maybe you should do it in September and get it, there's a lot of learning that I think can be done and can make projects better. I think the challenge is that the first projects create an impression. And whatever that impression is sometimes then lasts until we can figure out how to mitigate that.
So I hear what you said about the rolling film. But that's like the first impression when I see that. It's like, oh,
it's not even.
Yeah. Whereas from the other point of view, it's following nature or anything.
Following the contour, right. But again, right? Two different people in the same room might just have a different impression.
Well, and I missed the first part because I was at the state fair.
Oh, good.
That's why I'm sorry.
No.
So I didn't even know what's appropriate. But we're doing a solar pollinator garden at the state fair.
Yeah.
You know that, right?
Yes.
Okay. And we've been saying that if people wanted to get into a garden, to go to Certs, look on the Certs website. Is that still right?
We have all sorts of tools for you.
Okay. C basically tells us to go there.
Yeah.
To go to you folks. And because you have the best website. And then we're talking about native bees, more than honeybees this time. So last year was honeybees, this time it's wild bees. And why didn't you want me to ask the question?
Oh, no, I think you should ask that. Now's time for it.
One of our solar installers said that there's a problem with the zinc leaching off of the racking into the soil and doing a bad job on that soil.
What is it leached off?
The zinc from the racking,
Zinc.
solar racking.
Zinc.
And remediation would mean removing 6 feet of soil.
Oh, that'd be good to have.
So instead of helping the soil, it's not It can be really damaging. Well, you know, that made my stomach turn since we just made a big graphic panel about how wonderful, you know, how you said it's not everything's not wonderful about it. You know, just because we like solar doesn't mean it's great, right? There's all kinds of things. So I just wondered if you'd ever heard that. I only heard it from one person, and I saw this one contractor, and so I tried to immediately search, you know, to find more on it. All I found was companies saying new hardened zinc coating, you know, doesn't leach. And so then I thought, okay, wait a minute, now maybe it's been leaching for 20 years and now they're coming up with something that's not. I just wondered if you had heard it.
I had not heard that, but it seems like if whomever it was that said that this is happening, it would be worth lots of additional investigation in terms of
I know, we didn't, obviously.
sites, evidence, location, testing. I mean, like, that's something, again, so if that has happened, that's something to get ahead of right away. So that whatever's being used for development, we're using the right stuff in the right place so that we get the outcomes that we want, right? Because there are lots of things that, you know, we can anticipate, and there are always going to be things that we don't. But as many of them as we can, we should, and we should get ahead of it.
Responsible for something investigating, just like Ellen Anderson's out there and they're doing all these research work. Wouldn't that be one of the things they take a look at?
It absolutely could be, and it doesn't mean that that it's not happening somewhere else, right? So like that's one of those things, because you can do that seems like a real, like, particular issue with a particular material or sort of product.
All wrapping for all solar systems are made out of zinc, you know, coated steel. It's not so just particular to one thing. It's very in it, right? Would you say?
Well, but I mean, we've had lots of examples of solar systems that have gone up and there have been a batch of bad inverters. Well, we've had solar systems forever. They all have inverters. That doesn't mean that every single solar system inverter is bad, right? And so, as with any material, you know, like you got a pair of jeans and it said it was going to be this size, but you got it from the top of the cut or the bottom of the cut, and it wasn't quite the same fit. So like the same sort of things can happen. And we've had solar development happening for a long time. I mean, it's sort of newer to Minnesota in terms of the scale that we're seeing it now, but there are lots of other places that have seen lots of solar development. And if this hasn't been a problem in other places, or maybe it is and they've figured it out, or maybe there was a bet. I mean, like, just because there is a problem or someone says that there is a problem doesn't mean that that is a widespread problem. And so we should be very cautious about sort of the sky is falling when we should really get more data and understand sort of, is that a product issue? Is it a one-off, this batch of a product issue? Is it an issue? Like, those are all things that I would want to get a lot more data.
Absolutely. So I'm just letting you know about it because you're in the position where you can maybe ask those questions.
Maybe there's another industry that's kind of ahead, because all those big irrigators in the farm fields, those are all zinc-plated steel, because I was a field of irrigation. And
There's been a lot of that stuff for a long time.
Zinc tank, and then put 500-pound ingots in. So, you know, every one of those, everything is zinc-plated in the farm fields.
All those power towers out there, you know.
Yeah.
So it'd be worth finding out actually the name of the person who brought it up and what that example is, to be able to do some follow-up, because that's the only way that you can actually get more information.
Yeah, last night during the training, it was interesting, of one that came up that I thought was really interesting. There was I forget, Jack Klumke, I think, had brought it up about production of solar in Minnesota relative to Arizona.
Yeah.
And people were like challenging that, like, well, what do you mean? There's definitely more solar in Arizona. But then Jack turned that around and said, yeah, and climate change is happening, and there's more dust out there now, and so the production is not quite as good as you would expect, you know. So all kinds, like you say, all kinds of things are starting to affect different things. So
Yeah. We are in exciting times.
yeah.
Yeah.
Let's get this.
Thanks. Very well done.